So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kyle Renner. I manage the Institute for International Economic Policy here at the George Washington University. And it is my pleasure to introduce Klaus Tilmes, who's director of the Global Practice Group for Trade and Competitiveness at the World Bank, who will be sharing with us issues in World Bank Group Trade and Competitiveness, Global Practice, support to developing country. Klaus, please.
So good evening, and I know it's been, based on just what I heard in the last 45 minutes, has already been an exciting and sort of fun-filled day, so I hope you'll stay with me, and I'm looking forward to dinner. I wanted to share with you some of those discussions around e-commerce and digital trade, and I think this is very timely because the same discussion is actually taking place right now. So what I'm presenting here, and I see some of my colleagues, is really sort of the work that we are doing right now. So this is, I think, quite timely. And I would also like to thank our co-organizers, the Institute for International Economic Policy at GWU, and the sponsors, ICANN, Google, eBay, and the Center for International Business Education and Research. So let's start with the definition. And that may seem very obvious, but in fact, this is something that we should always remember, that this is still a fairly untested and not fully defined term. So since we don't yet have that standardized definition, what I would like to propose is that we'll define e-trade as a sale of goods and services through digital networks. And why is this important? Because one of the challenges that we have is without a standard definition, it's actually very difficult to start collecting systematically data around e-trade. And so our interaction with statistical agencies really depends on having a clear definition. It's important to recognize that what we are talking about is not only goods and services which actually travel online, like music downloads, a streamed video, a PDF, and a consultant's report, but also more traditional services like boots, an airplane ride, or a pair of shoes. And for the sake of development, we are not only talking about international trade, but also about digital changes within countries, which might more properly be called e-commerce. A couple of ideas of what we are not referring to as e-trade, including emails, telephone calls, and e-government, internet governments, and Bitcoin. So it's therefore important to actually tell you a little bit about what we know about the overall scope of the e-trade business. And one of the challenges is that the available data that we have is actually very partial. Most of this is relying on data that we are receiving from private sources, such as eMarketer, portrayed in this slide. And what they show ultimately is a very robust growth across, in terms of cross-border digital trade. Particularly in developing countries, these numbers refer to B2C digital trade. And if we were to include B2B businesses, probably it would be 5 to 10 times larger. The main takeaway, though, is that we see very robust growth, 25% worldwide, 30% in the Middle East, 50% in Asia Pacific. And that's sort of the projection 2012 to 2017. Why is this really important for us, and why are we excited about this, is because digital trade actually offers enormous potential for boosting international trade. It has huge opportunities for multiplying the economic and social benefits. It increases the exports of goods and services, promotes diversification, allows traders to tap into new markets, expands export baskets, allows countries to link to global value chains, increases the competitiveness by expanding the offer of goods and services available for domestic producers, and increases, therefore, the quality. I think a very important dimension from a developing country point of view is also that digital trade holds the promise of reducing radically the cost of trade, lowering trade costs, and increasing export competitiveness is a really important agenda for us. I don't know to what extent you have seen this number, I think, or this particular breakdown. It's coming from eBay, and it really gives you sort of an insight in terms of what is behind the world of digital trade and why, particularly for SMEs, this is a very important agenda. It enables very small firms to have a global reach, so we are starting to refer to micro multinationals that have a global reach. And the data from, or the data breakdown from SME shows something that really has a lot of promise. It shows that particularly SMEs find it much easier to participate. They sell to more destinations. They have a higher survival rate, those that are participating. And they're also much more competitive. So the level of export concentration is actually a lot less. So if you look at it, I think I read one of the background papers that says somewhere between 100 to 350 million SMEs potentially could participate in digital trade. And that, of course, is an agenda in and of itself that I'll refer to later. The numbers that you're seeing here are for Chile, but we have seen similar analysis from eBay also for Indonesia, India, Jordan, Peru, Thailand, Ukraine. So this is a sort of a robust indication in terms of why digital trade is really a game changer when it comes down to the access to trading opportunities. Another important part is that this agenda also is an equalizer in terms of who has access to it. This gives a lot of opportunities for women, disadvantaged groups that actually face typically much higher barriers to participating. So this is an example where I think we see many positive spillovers in terms of the agenda of why digital trade is really, from an entrepreneurship, from a gender point of view, from a point of view of survival and supporting survival of entrepreneurs, a very important development. Now, having said that and sort of talking about this, what is equally striking, maybe another message, is that the full potential is way not realized. So right now, only about 22% of the people across the world have ever bought something online. And if you put this into context, right now we have about 40%, or the latest estimate, about 40% of the world's population has access to the internet. In Africa, that's about 20%. And so maybe only half of those people have ever bought anything. And then when you start looking at what do people use their internet access to, whether it's through cell phone or through other mechanisms, the number one use is actually checking on families. Number two is social media. And if you look at sort of the concentration of where the most Facebook users are, besides the US, the other four countries are India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Mexico. In other words, the message is when it comes down to shopping online, for the most part, this is still very much an underdeveloped area with a lot of potential. And the numbers and the data that you see here are really mostly for OECD countries. So if you look at some of our countries that we are working with, Turkey or Bulgaria, less than 10% of the people with experience, with access to internet have actually ever bought something online. Less than 5%, Thailand, Mexico, and South Africa. So in other words, the online experience is for many countries still sort of in the future. And if you sort of go down even further beyond the individual to firms, even fewer firms have actually something to sell online. And so the potential of the internet to support entrepreneurship, employment, and incomes in low and middle income countries is almost entirely untapped. And that's where we see a lot of the future potential. And you heard some of this already this afternoon in terms of what we are doing to support this. So in order to, for E-Trade to achieve its full potential, there needs to be an appropriate ecosystem. And sort of just putting people online is not enough. And the recent World Development Report that was just issued around digital dividends really talked about or brought up this notion of the analog complement. In other words, what are the enabling factors for the digital age for development to take off? It is not enough to put everyone online, and some of those analog complements start with something as simple and as straightforward as literacy. Illiteracy is something that requires that people actually know how to read and write. Latest estimate and conservative estimates that there are at least 920 million people with access to the internet who do not know how to read and write. And those are only about 20 countries that we sampled, that McKinsey actually referred to. On the firm level, the level of maturity is even further distributed and probably even more scarce. Yeah, of course, those that are able to sell online probably by using prefabricated and available platforms like Alibaba or eBay, but there are definitely very few firms or SMEs that have the capacity to put up their own website, to collect fees, to transact electronically, and to do more than just showing a picture of their product. So if you think of e-commerce the way it works for you, where you just pull out a credit card, order something, have it delivered by UPS or DHL, that's clearly not the reality in developing countries. And at least a third of people with online access don't have credit cards, so some even don't even have postal addresses. This raises sort of a larger question, which is sort of what's the policy environment that we are seeing in many developing countries? And many of them do not yet fully support and accommodate the internet. The laws were written at a time when we didn't really envisage PayPal or Skype, which did not really look at competition in terms of telecom and internet services. And so in many cases, we actually see a relatively unfriendly environment for e-commerce. And localization policies, which the panel just referred to, I think is one of the main hindrances or one of the main barriers to allow for cross-border data flows, and that also limit the ability to use in-country servers for doing business. So this is clearly localization policies are one of the key policy barriers that I want to return to a little bit later. Access to the internet itself is growing, but still quite a challenge. Right now, we have about 3 billion people that are connected to the internet. And so that, in some way, the first prerequisite for participating in e-commerce. So the key question is, where's that next billion coming from? We are, in some way, in the golden age of providing now more connectivity through undersea cables and satellite access. What we are doing and what is sort of in our forefront is what type of infrastructure investment would actually help and support e-commerce. The cost of service subscription and devices such as cell phones varies widely from country to country. And one of the key questions, of course, is if you expand access, what are the terms for granting this access? Will it be monopolized? Will there be competitive access to the networks that we are setting up? The World Bank group has invested in ICT to lower barriers to telephony and internet access. Just two examples. In the Pacific region, in August 2013, we helped finance a 830-kilometer fiber optic cable to connect Tonga, Fiji, and onwards to the global broadband network. And as a result of that, the household price for months of internet service per gigabyte actually fell by about 60%, and bandwidth utilization went up by tenfold. Afghanistan, a similar example, quite dramatic. $22 million credit supported sector reforms that made the telecommunication markets more competitive and attracted more than $1.2 billion in private investment. The number of subscribers increased from 2002 to 2010 from 57,000 to 13.4 million, and the cost for a minute of call went from $2 to about 10 cents. Now, getting onto the internet is maybe sort of an achievable goal, but there are quite a number of additional obstacles that are standing in the way. Let me point out to two. In every one of those 10 developing countries that we are showing here, the number of people with access to the internet exceeds the number of people with access to credit cards. There are probably over 1 billion people in the world who in principle could use the internet, but they don't have access to credit cards. So they need to find alternative ways of actually making these payments work. PayPal, Alipay, maybe two possibilities. In the case of Kenya, we have seen M-Pesa as another way of creatively working around this barrier. But of course, the ability to do this internationally is then quite limited, even in the case of Kenya. So there is a surprising number of online sellers that still operate very much like in the last century, cash on delivery. And in this case, of course, some of the benefits that we are anticipating from e-trade are not fully realized because the risk and the upfront cost for production and delivery are still fairly high. The data on mail delivered at home are there to just make the general point that not everyone in the world actually has a physical mailing address. We need to find innovative solutions to actually work out what this analog complement might look like for e-trade. Now, in terms of data localization, an increasing number of countries are engaged in this. And these policies actually, on the face of it, take a number of different forms. They may require firms who wish to do business to store the data locally. They may seek to prevent data from being transferred outside of the country, or prevent people inside the country from accessing data outside the country. Or they can require firms to use local data service providers, for example, in government procurement. There are many reasons why governments may opt to have data localization policies, and many of them sound on the face of it very plausible: protecting privacy, keeping foreigners from surveillance of domestic citizens, economic development of local IT firms, aiding domestic law enforcement in catching criminals, censorship, and so on. So some of those reasons may very well be legitimate. The questions that we are asking from a trade point of view is whether this is the best way of actually accomplishing them. And some of them, particularly if you have a background in trade, many of them really become equivalent to non-trade tariff barriers. And so the question that we should ask ourselves is whether these data localization policies really present the best options that is out there, and whether there are maybe better alternatives. So the principle that there should be a presumption in favor of free data flow is reflected also in recent trade agreements like the TPP. One of the interesting questions to ask is to what extent localization policies match policy objectives. And some of the examples that I wanted to cite here are coming from a recent paper by Chander and Lee on digital nationalism. So I found it very interesting to read that in the case of Australia, for instance, there's a policy called the Personally Controlled Electronic Health Records Act. And what this means is private health information of Australian citizens cannot be digitally transferred beyond Australia. And of course, the objective behind this is to protect privacy. Now imagine that, of course, many doctors have websites. They allow the filling of prescriptions, the setting of appointments through those websites. Now, if you're an Australian on vacation and you feel you want to change an appointment from outside of Australia, from a strictly legal point of view, you're actually committing a felony. So you have technically actually broken the law. It sounds that this is pretty silly, but it's that's where the point is, where localization policies and digital trade are sort of not always compatible with each other. And the question that we should ask is, what is sort of a better way of aligning those two? There's, of course, also the question that require, for instance, big companies to have a local server in order to do business in a country to protect privacy. That may have some unintended consequences. In some way, it allows those companies' information to be much more vulnerable to being hacked. It probably also sets up suboptimal ways of combining and taking apart data for privacy purposes. And I think these questions of what actually makes sense, and from a major business point of view, I think comes, and I think the panel before already raised the question that digital or localization policies are becoming increasingly important in the location decisions of major companies. Now, what does data localization do to national competitiveness? Multinationals that are participating and that are coordinating their business operations across different countries may have very good reasons to particularly be concerned about this. Whether this is sharing information on research and development, human resource information, exchange marketing strategies. Increasingly, they are looking at a fairly uninhibited and protected exchange of data across borders. And in some way, what this also tells us from our point of view is trying to prevent this or setting up these barriers may actually unintentionally harm the ability of countries to compete as potential location points for participation in these international production processes. For the last remaining slides, I wanted to just briefly give you sort of an overview in terms of what we at the World Bank are doing, specifically in the trade and competitiveness practice around digital trade. We are increasingly engaged with countries on the e-commerce agenda. This involves work, for instance, on entrepreneurship support through InfoDev, work on policy and regulatory reform in the trade practice, work on e-trade logistics and trade facilitation, and our newest area of engagement around big data for development. We are also more broadly in global engagements and knowledge generation, so we are part of the active emerging group around Aid for E-Trade movement that Michael referred to. We partner not only with other organizations around the world on these issues, like UNCTAD and the WTO, but also with the private sector. And what is really interesting from an internal World Bank point of view is increasingly this also requires us to work very closely with our other practices within the bank group. For instance, much of our work on ICT, backbone services, and on broadband involves our work with the transport and ICT group. When it comes down to digital and digital payment system, financial inclusion, we work very closely with finance and markets. So in some way, this is for us also a new way of combining different aspects of World Bank work that increasingly requires us to actually work across sort of internal organizational boundaries. Let me sort of spend a few minutes on what we do in terms of digital entrepreneurship support, because this has been a really interesting era, and we see this very much as a pilot of things to come. The Innovation and Entrepreneurship Program in Trade and Competitiveness supports sort of on the digital side, digital entrepreneurs in this path from mind to market. And we do this by supporting them through incubators, various types of mentorship, technology support, targeted networking opportunities, but also to involve accelerators. And accelerators that really help startups to generate possibilities for high growth breakthroughs, intensive training, equity-based investments, and early stage funding programs. We have also started work on the digital entrepreneurship diagnostic toolkit, and Maya is here. She's leading that work together with colleagues. And that gives us sort of a way also of calibrating where different countries are actually on this path to digital entrepreneurship. Some of the exciting examples that I think sort of at least keeps my mind and my fascination always on this topic is, for instance, Soko is a Kenyan jewelry design outfit whose product you actually can get at Nordstrom. And it actually works. I've checked it out. Then there's something that is maybe less obvious but equally exciting, which is a company or an initiative called Farmia in Serbia, which allows and has facilitated the trading of livestock across the Balkans. So rather than shipping your cow, pig, or other animal physically, this is a site that allows sort of putting together the health, the weight information, basic information, and allows that to be a part of the trading environment around livestock in the Balkans. For both buyers and sellers, it also includes the exchange of veterinary information. So really a breakthrough when it comes down to making that type of work much more attractive. And I could see easily that this type of application would have great application, for instance, in the Sahel, because there's a huge market for livestock as well. So it's sort of, that's where we see really interesting applications in terms of making trading and entrepreneurship come together. Another example that gives you sort of a reality check in terms of how the other side of the world lives is Nepal. There's a group called Info Developers, and that group is coming together to develop apps and other software solution in Nepal and to actually start exporting them, putting them on iStore or Google Play. Now, the problem is in Nepal, there are exactly 200 people that have access to internationally valid credit cards. So the CEO of Info Developer basically hands out his credit card to the team of Info Developers so that they are actually able to put their applications online. It's an interesting way also of sort of saying where e-trade and financial inclusion, digital payment system is really one part of an agenda that we are trying to move forward in lockstep. Support for this 21st century regulatory environment that we are trying to organize our work around really starts by taking a close look at the regulatory framework that we are finding. To what extent is this weak, obsolete? Does it create barriers for e-commerce? And then a coordinated effort to actually bring this and start to reform this environment. The type of regulatory changes that sort of could be part of this package may include modernizing the financial and telecom regulations to make them suitable for the internet economy. We just recently had a whole series of meetings with delegations from Africa, and one of the key questions that came up, whether it's Ethiopia, Senegal, or Cote d'Ivoire, is sort of what is the competitive environment for telecom services? And I think that sort of, again, it's a point which many delegations sort of were a bit taken aback because there's still very much sort of a state monopoly type thinking. But the reality, of course, is if you want to encourage this, you really need to start also combining competition policies with e-trade and really put this together in an overall regulatory environment. Another one, another opportunity that we see is to update, for instance, the laws around electronic signatures. Really start challenging or reviewing localization policies for servers as a condition for doing business, and consumer protection policies for online transactions that recognize special issues involving in trading over online platforms. We're also working in the trading competitiveness practice on trade facilitation currently in about at least 50 countries, but I know at least in 30 countries there's a very strong push to actually use the WTA Trade Facilitation Agreement as a catalyst for supporting some of these analog complements that are necessary to actually work in this digital trading environment. Automation accounts for maybe a third of the available time savings for small shipments that we could realize. And what this means specifically, for instance, we're working on trading information portals, which might be getting to something like the single window that is envisioned in the Bali Agreement to substantially lower the trading cost for small and medium enterprises. We have implemented this in countries like Laos, Lesotho, and Botswana. In Central America, we are working with air cargo shippers and the general express industry to address regulatory, procedural, border management, and technological challenges. So in other words, this does not just only involve customs and other control agencies, but also the private sector environment, some of the state-owned enterprises that are in charge of operating air cargo and express terminals. We're also seeing, interestingly, an interesting nexus between the digital e-commerce agenda and the urban environment, urban planning. And sort of a very simple example for this is that many regulations for delivery of goods and parcels within cities were developed in an area where you assume that most of the packages were delivered by trucks. So you have very specific regulation in terms of area pricing, which roads you could use, when you could actually deliver packages, what charges were levied. And so one of the changes that we would like to introduce and that we push for in terms of making urban cities competitive and more amenable for e-commerce is to also look for alternatives, whether this is delivery by motorcycles, using petrol station as delivery point as is taking place in some countries. the question, of course, is everyone's imagination is when do we start delivery of packages by drones? And I recently heard a very interesting example, just to sort of give your own mind sort of something to work with. In the case of Tanzania, we are working on one potential initiative that has drones deliver critical blood supplies over distances of up to about 100 kilometers. And these are drones that you can still deliver by hand. And we have sort of figured out that there's actually a very attractive business. And it's, in fact, some of the companies that are exploring this in Tanzania are actually from developed countries, because one of the preconditions was actually the clearance by the Ministry of Defense to allow the airspace so that we could actually experiment, or that we could see what type of innovations are possible. And one of the questions that I then had is, so when do we see sort of more heavier delivery packages? And the point seems to be that if you want to deliver up to 100 pounds in terms of drone capacity, you would actually need to have launch sites to do this. In the case of Dar es Salaam, there appear to be so many solar panels on high buildings. There's actually a business model in terms of using drones to deliver and recharge themselves in major city areas. So in some ways, this is maybe sounds a little bit science fiction, but I can easily see that sort of that type of experimentation definitely has a place. And I think somebody mentioned the ability of developing countries to leapfrog forward. I think that's clearly one of those leapfrogging ideas that certainly makes sense when you don't actually have a functioning road network. One of the and Prasanna is here. One of the interesting points that I wanted to mention is what do we do in terms of big data development, for development? We see this as an area that can benefit both firms as well as governments. We are working with national statistical agencies in about 25 countries. But we also see increasing demand from the private sector to use big data. And I think there's a lot that we are learning from them and vice versa. There's a whole range of technologies that could actually be put to very interesting use when it comes down to micro-level agricultural productivity data that I'm very interested in. I'm very interested in trying to see to what extent we can trace down to the parcel level what type of agricultural product is being produced where. For urban planning exercises, very important and very interesting to actually have geospatial data. We do a lot of land registration and land cadastering right now in Uganda and Tanzania through drones. So that is information that is very, very vital for land management. And we also see very important possibilities for using these type of data also, for instance, for building easier ability for small firms to and for individuals to actually get access to financial markets. So I think this whole digital ID, for instance, is one area where big data have a big role to play. Final question is sort of what were some of the questions that we are wrestling with. One of them has to do clearly with sort of coming up with something that maybe some of us, we have seen the benefit of having the doing business indicator or the logistic performance indicator. So something an analog to this or digital complement to this one, which basically gives us cross-country information in terms of digital readiness of countries. That would tell us really where is the country situated and what type of policy changes would actually be necessary to promote e-trade for fighting poverty. The ultimate goal, of course, is we know a lot about what may be some of the barriers. What we haven't quite figured out is what is actually the most, the breakthrough, the silver bullet, the most important thing that we should actually change and address. So this question of what type of analytics would be useful in terms of advising governments of where they should start focusing their efforts, what is the sequencing path for these type of reforms. And I think that's something which we are just getting involved in. I know that in the Balkans, there are a number of governments that are very interested in this. The private sector is very interested. So I see that as very quickly one of the areas that will start informing also the type of policy advice that we can provide. So thank you very much, and happy to take your questions.
So again, if you would just please introduce yourself and keep your questions succinct. We'll take several at a time.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for being here. I think the question is really how are we going to have good strategy? And my major concern is for the benefit of the general public, not just consumer. Currently, and I think historically, World Bank and IMF have some mistake to benefit multinational corporations, privatizing the water and so on and so on, and increasing the public debt and at the burden of the general public of foreign country. And now we have all this discussion. My concern is also, are we going to benefit the general public, or we are going to help those big corporations? For instance, with all those secrecies or all those lawsuits written in the TPP, and they automatically benefit the big corporation or the lawyer occupation. They themselves don't know what's in there. And these thousands of pages of TPP is almost impossible for individual or small business to understand it. And especially now in this internet ages now, they have hacking probability and possibility. And before we just talking about big the horrified to steal a car is horrified. But what I'm trying to say is that big corporation and law enforcement steal a car in a regular basis. So we have to be alert. How are we going to protect the general public with all the dimensions that we can think of?
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mr. Cruz. Thank you for holding the African Business Dialogue on Tuesday. Thank you. Again, my name is Rosemary Segero. I'm the president of Segero's International Group. I focus on small and medium businesses in Kenya and Nigeria and other countries. Looking at your presentation and the African dialogue, how do we work with you? Because I find myself, I'm looking for my own investors to help my projects where I come from in the rural areas. As the mama say, how do you incorporate what we are doing with the SMEs, which are not funded, which are not given, with what you are doing here with digital? Because this is one of my focus, digital, and also focusing on people with disability. How do you incorporate them, include them into that, the SMEs, and using the digital, the digital technology, looking at their disabilities? So how will the World Bank work with us and those that are existing to make this happen? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. My name is Daniel Crosby, and I live in Geneva, and I work with a law firm there called King & Spalding. One of your previous slides mentioned I think it was the new relevance of trade liberalization, and you also mentioned you work with the WTO. And I'm wondering, these digital trade rules that we have don't seem to be coming from the WTO, and the TPP doesn't cover a lot of the poorer developing countries. So what path do you see forward to have the broader range of countries be able to make commitments and attract investments and benefit from this whole e-trade and e-commerce situation that you're talking about without a process in Geneva?
Okay. Yeah, why don't I just respond to, maybe I can take your question first in terms of Are we working for multinationals, or do we also have the interests of the general public in mind? I've been working at the World Bank now for about 28 years. And I think one of the reasons why I actually wanted to work there and still am very committed is because I believe actually in the mission. And I see the mission very much in terms of reducing poverty. And to me, I can give you any number of examples where actually the digital potential is directly benefiting consumers and the general public. If I think, for instance, this is a question that came up right now in the whole situation around drought in Ethiopia and Kenya. One of the interesting ways of using digital infrastructure is to actually allow aid organizations like the World Food Program not to deliver food as a parcel, but to actually deliver cash payments to people to families that are living in these areas, who then have purchasing power to actually buy from local farmers. To me, that's a virtual cycle. In the case of India, where the vast majority of people don't have something that we take for granted, whether this is an ID, whether this is a social security number, for them that is a major enabler to actually receive benefit payments, to allow transactions to take place. So in some way, I would say that's where I see a lot of the potential. And I think what I was also trying to say, digital e-trade, the biggest equalizer is actually the fact that many small and medium enterprises, mom and pop shops, people that have 4 or 5 employees, they really have almost no possibility to participate in the global trading system or in the global exchange. And I think that's sort of the vision that we see very much behind our support for the digital e-trade agenda. So I have to say, multinationals will do what multinationals do. They increasingly, of course, will make their decisions in terms of where to take locations and where to make these foreign direct investment based on what they see as the legal and regulatory environment. So I have to say on this one, make no mistake, TPP may sound like a big threat to many, but I can also say that there is an even larger number of countries and policymakers that feel that if they do not understand and if they do not align their policies, they will be completely left behind. So I can tell you one of the first calls that we got when the TPP announcement was not from the US, it was from Lesotho. And they wanted to know, what does TPP actually mean for our textile industry? What do we have to do in order to actually not be left behind? It's the same question that people in Ethiopia are asking. So in some way, that really sets a very different dynamic into motion, because countries really are trying to not be left behind when it comes down to global production processes, and I have that discussion just about every night with my wife at home. They are here to stay, or you can believe that you can roll back the time. I'm not entirely sure that I believe that you can roll it all back. For me, it's more a question of how do you actually enable countries to participate in this, and that's where a lot of our work is. To your question, I think you're in some way in a very fortunate situation, because Kenya is actually one of the trailblazers when it comes down to the entire digital economy. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, we actually had an exchange program, maybe 6 years ago, with the Safaricom founder who joined us, because there was so much to learn from the M-Pesa experience. I think what we are also doing, particularly in Kenya, is to use the basically a digital lab approach to create an environment for entrepreneurs to actually start experimenting and developing digital applications. We see this in Kenya, Senegal, Accra, South Africa. And I think this has been going on for the last probably 7 to 10 years now. And what we are seeing is the emergence of a digital entrepreneurship group in Africa that is able to pitch their ideas with the best and brightest in Europe. They're able to make connections in terms of getting access to acceleration funding, which I think is fantastic. So I would say, in some way, when we made recently a presentation, the Africa team, about what we are doing on trade, one of the first questions was to us was, please make sure that this is not all for Alibaba. Please make sure that you understand that there is actually a digital class in Africa that has enormous talents, and they know the marketplace, and they're actually able to really play ball, and they're able to put together very interesting applications. To your question, I'm mindful that I'm only able to give you sort of a partial answer. We have so part of my answer is actually a lot of this has to do with how do we organize our own network of contacts to make the case. There is a public forum in Geneva in September. This is the first time that the private sector and the SMEs will actually make presentations to the WTO in terms of what they see as a very important agenda around digital trade. The B20, sort of the business community that is organized as part of the international process, they have also clearly identified an agenda, particularly around digital trade that consists of GVC, how do SMEs get access to GVC, access to finance, and very importantly also access to certification schemes that are currently not yet fully accessible to SMEs. So in some way, we are still in the advocacy phase, but we are really trying to bring these different groups together, UNCTAD, Aid for E-Trade, the World SME Forum, ourselves, to actually give the WTO also an opportunity to see a range of views when it comes down to what, for instance, SMEs and the private sector in general are really looking for. And so I'm sort of positively hopeful, knowing some of the advocates that are behind these groups, that they will make a very good statement and will have some influence. Thank you. I don't know whether there are other questions.
I think we have another, time for another question.
I'm Chandra, UC Davis. Thanks very much for your
Sure.
great presentation and incredibly important set of statistics. I wanted to ask you about your member states and the pressures you get. Your member states have lots of different views on these matters. I'm sorry. Thank you. So I apologize. Anupam Chandra, UC Davis. So the countries of the world are very divided on how to approach the digital environment. Some want to create kind of protectionist import substitution models, essentially, where others are more open and want to create kind of take advantage of global platforms immediately. What are the politics that you're finding within your member states, as you between the kind of import substitution model and the more kind of open kind of global approach?
Are there any other questions? No. There's one more. Okay.
Hi, thanks. David Weller from Google. Just to pick up on Daniel Crosby's question, if you could talk a little bit about how the bank is working with other international institutions, particularly UNCTAD and the WTO, or maybe you're not, but if there's collaboration going on, because I know all these institutions are looking at these issues. And then the second question is and maybe picking a little bit up on Anupam's question, concretely, what are member governments coming to the World Bank in this space and asking for tangibly? What's kind of the concrete request that you're getting from member governments in this space?
Okay, let me, sorry, there's one more question.
Hi, Usman Ahmed with PayPal. You mentioned that there hasn't been good work done on measurement and kind of assessing the impacts of the barrier, so you can't say concretely what removing certain barriers would do, but you've been studying this area for a while. My question is, what do you think would have the most impact if we were to remove some of the barriers that you've talked about, whether that's financial services, identity, trade, the various issues that you've talked about? Which one do you think is the one that deserves the most short-term focus?
Okay, these are three very easy questions to answer. So as far as to your question, in some way, I'm sure that countries will ask. They will ask at different levels. So I'm not quite sure what they're asking at the level of the board and sort of the president. But I can tell you at the level where it filters down to me, we are responding to countries that actually want to change. So I think in some way it's the positive effect is that this is an agenda that has so much attraction and so much interest that I don't think that we need to push anything. With one exception, or with two exceptions, or with three exceptions. So one exception is clearly what we would like to do, and I said it earlier, we would like to see the introduction of competition. The discussion, let's say if you were a country, let's say called Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire or Nigeria, and we would want to have a discussion with you, probably one of the very first questions is to actually ask, let us take a look at your overall industry structure in telecoms. I think that's one of the very interesting and promising discussion that we're having, for instance, with the government of Kenya. They're very interested to take some of the findings and some of the possibilities from the World Development Report forward and actually take this into a lending operation, where I think a lot of this is really around policy reform. I can think of another example where a country is actually paying us to help them develop the SME ecosystem. Kuwait has put together one of the largest funds for SME development. For them, it's really a question about non-oil diversification. So the whole digital industry, the digital services, is definitely an area that they would like to get more savvy at. So in some way, it is for us actually, and you're in a unique position where those that want to reform come to you, and then what we do is we'll try to figure out what are possible changes, and then we use our convening power to actually tell the rest of the world about this is what has happened in this country, would you not want to do this? So the story in some way sort of works on itself, and of course those countries that are not reforming are the ones that in some way, whether this is through doing business or the logistic performance index or digital readiness index, basically see that they are falling behind, and that makes for a very difficult conversation if you are a policymaker, a politician, an investor. And we just had this morning a discussion in Africa because I'm looking after Africa and the Middle East, among other things. And one of the questions that I asked is, after the oil price decline and the resource boom in Africa being more or less over, what has actually changed in terms of top-level governments wanting to improve their business environment? And it's amazing how much that has really taken off again over the last 15 months, because I think in some way there's a level of rationality that has set in, is that cross-country benchmarks do have very important signals. And there's actually a tradition in terms of starting to become savvier in terms of regulatory reforms that I think most countries are willing to embrace. My second caveat is, and that's sort of one that I personally feel very strongly about, and I can see that that's sort of playing out in the background. It's the quest for dominance around platforms. And I think my view on this one is there's room for more than just one platform. I think there are certainly 3 or 4 or 5 platforms that we are starting to see on the regional basis that have started to build out their own ecosystem, that are really reaching out, particularly to SMEs. That's one of the areas that we are particularly interested in. And I think there's healthy competition that we would want to see. I think a third area has to do with trying to also look at the larger poverty agenda. I mentioned illiteracy presupposes that there's literacy. So I know that one of the next World Development Reports is actually on the role of education, and I'm sure that there will be a very strong emphasis around using digital for education. So I think this whole agenda is one that is not just about multinationals, but it is really also about citizenry and those that are actually not having access to it. I think, and you actually asked me the question about disadvantaged group. One of the really interesting pilots that we have is entrepreneurship for women. One of the interesting findings, we are doing this in Pakistan and Nigeria, one of the interesting findings, maybe not surprisingly, is the biggest take-up is actually by women who are using digital work at home. And so in that sense, it has become a real good indicator for employment generation. The question in terms of what are we doing on the international scene, we can discuss more about this. I can give you the acronyms of who we are working with. We are working with UNCTAD, we are working with WTO, with WEF, working with the OECD. There are multiple agendas. I think and we're using, I think quite, particularly our practice actually, quite well the G20 process to help influence the agenda, or at least to prepare some of the key policy points. When it comes down to it, it's actually a very small set of fora. I would say if you had asked me this question 2 or 3 years ago, I probably would not have been able to answer this question. But given the orientation that our practice now has, I think the WTO has really been one of our key partnerships. We have written, I think, and we are investing in this partnership quite a lot. But at the same time, we have also strong discussions with TPP countries in terms of what they need to do. So in some way, we're trying not to show preferences, but we are trying to basically say there's a larger agenda that actually needs to be informed by what both WTO and we can contribute to that. So it's really a big part, and I think it's also a big part of our overall global advocacy around this. And I think that's what you saw here. I mean, that's essentially the type of information that we would also discuss in Geneva or Paris. What would have the most impact? Based on, okay, I'm not the expert in this area, but based on what I know in the bank, talking to my colleagues, I think the ID for Development initiative has a huge impact. That's scalable. I think what InfoDev is doing, it's a very interesting pilot, and I think it has demonstration effect because not too many companies, not too many international organizations are actually investing in this over such a long period of time. I think we have learned a lot about this. So digital ecosystem development and understanding that better, I think, is another area. I think tackling the trade agenda, particularly in terms of the non-trade tariff barriers around digital trade, I think is a third one. And I think that all more or less creates sort of an enabling environment and has very interesting demonstration effects, because whatever we are doing around digital entrepreneurship, I think now that we have had the benefit of almost a decade on this one, we can really start seeing that's about what it takes in terms of stamina and time to work on this. So that would be sort of my 6:45 in the evening type answers to that question. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Klaus, for a fantastic talk. And thank you all for joining us today. We will kick off tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with our next sessions. For those of you watching online, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Please use the hashtag #DigitalTradeConf, and tweet at the IIEPGW and World Bank PSD accounts. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.